I want to do something a little different today. I want to incorporate more small group work, which I feel we've been neglecting a little bit. I also want to maximize our volunteers' efforts, and we're going to be focusing on the theme of clarity today. And so, to me, that means focusing on the opening. I think we can all agree that the openings are probably one of the most difficult parts to get through for a number of reasons. From an audience's standpoint, I think we can also agree that the more we know what we're in for, the more rewarding the talk seems to be. And this builds off the larger point of agreement, which is that, again, and we'll be retreating to this, speaking in front of an audience is an opportunity to impart information, foster a relationship, and to get the audience to change in some significantly beneficial way. But any one of those three individually can be accomplished by other means. If it's just information, once again, reading is going to be more efficient. If it's just information impartment. Secondly, if it's a relationship, you're probably going to be better off talking to them, taking them out to dinner, having a party. Lastly, if you only wanted to affect the kind of beneficial, significant change, you probably should hire a professional, shouldn't you? Makes sense. Someone who can really take the material, make it clear, convincing, and compelling. But to do all three, you have to go up there. You have to present your material as clearly as possible, and you have to do it in a way that really resonates with the audience. And those are these three points of connection that we've been talking about. Today we're really focusing on the clarity with which the information is presented, and specifically the opening. So, to begin with today, I'd like to take a look back at last week, or last time. Goodness, it isn't week, it's been 2 months, hasn't it? Happy post-Super Bowl, everyone. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of glad that it's all over. Yeah, so we'll just leave that there. So last time we worked on engagement, if you'll remember, and that's an important part of those three elements, connecting with an audience. And what we work on a lot is how you're able to bring your personality. You have a theoretically limitless supply of yourself, and so the more you can bring yourself to an audience, I think the better you will have at connecting with them. So I wanted to walk you through and invite you as experts and scientists, quite honestly, into a discussion of numbers. Now, I'm using numbers to bridge the gap with people like yourselves, but also to foster some objective development of skills. You can't really know something unless you're able to measure it. I mean, we all feel it, and that's what's difficult about this area. But I've been putting numbers to some of my work, our work, and I want to share those with you today. So first I want to begin with this fundamental premise that I alluded to, and that is that we don't have our speaker from last time here, so we have one of them. You are here today, but unfortunately the camera died, so I will not be featuring you in my opening, which is probably maybe a good thing or a bad thing. So I want to go back to the baseline, this theory of a baseline, or this theory of the value of yourself as beneficial. I have found this to be a very effective starting point to see who you are when you are not stressed or performing. It is something that you're quite good at throughout your life. You know how to connect with people. And so I feel that that's a great resource. And so I always start there with my clients and say, all right, why don't you talk to me about your idea? Why don't you talk to me about the weather? Why don't you talk to me? Once I get a sense of how they use their voice, how fast do they speak? What range do they use? How often do they say, oh, Those are all things I say, okay, we should be able to bring this into the presentation. So I want to play just a selection of our last present, and I apologize. I didn't have his name when I was working. Michael? Or Mike? You know, Michael. I'm Christopher, but people call me Chris. Some people get touchy about that, so I want to know. I don't. Having said that, only one person calls me Christopher. Mary Finnerty. Strange, yeah. Anyway. Michael did a great job. All our presenters have been doing fantastic jobs. And this I'm going to play after because of my point I'm trying to make. And that is, this is Michael talking with Brian. And I think the audio will work. And if it doesn't, we'll make it work. Doesn't work. Can you help me? Well, it should be able to go up here. Oh, no, I can put that in. Yeah, sorry. We can do that. It may. Should. What? Well, it's kind of key to the presentation. Let me see if I can route the audio through the speakers. There. No. Well, I could play it really loud and you'd be able to get a sense of it. All right, I'll just do the best I can. Okay, so you'll try to listen. Oh, I could. That's a good idea. And I've got a much louder recording right here. This is it. So what I did is I went through it, and what you're seeing here, I went through the video. We recorded this video. It's not even video anymore. And I took the parts where he was speaking, where he was just talking, and I collected as much as I could, and it wasn't that much, but it was enough to give me a sense of his delivery.
Place that I feel like I heard it.
Back.
Earlier version, I had multiple points and I was highlighting them as I only had one because it was a short talk. I haven't completely got everything organized, and then once everything kind of falls into place, then I feel like I heard it in talk. But that's what I think is going on in my head. It felt good. I really kind of just, instead of, I guess, before I said I was kind of organizing, I'm also kind of, there's that kind of thing in the back of my mind, does this make sense? Is anybody going to care? So I kind of try to let go of some of that.
Okay, what do you hear? What are your reactions to that? I mean, it's someone trying to express their thoughts. That's what's key. He's thoroughly connected what he's trying to say because he's standing up, trying to talk to Brian. He's trying to put words to the thoughts that are coming right away. So it's very real. It's also a little fragmented, but he's leveraging every ounce of his ability to communicate and express himself. So there's a lot going on vocally that's quite organic, and that to me is very valuable because it can resonate. So when we measure that, this is what we see. Now these numbers, and this is, I want to invite you into this conversation. There are three different metrics that, there are many different ways to measure voice, and these are just three that pop out. The pause portion is the percentage of silences there are, okay? So that's just how much he stopped talking, as opposed to going right through. This is how fast he spoke. These are syllables per second. This measures percentage of time. It's either he's talking or he's not talking, okay? And this right here is his pitch range. And the pitch range is the difference between the lowest fundamental frequency and the highest. Okay? By themselves, they don't have a tremendous amount of inherent, for my purposes, inherent meaning. There's nothing really compelling. There's no right pause portion. There's no right speech rate. I equate it to what's the right speed for a car? Well, it depends. Depends on where you are and what you're doing. All of these numbers, I believe, depend. But if this is how he uses it when he expresses himself talking to somebody, I'm like, okay, let's start there. This is what he selected organically, okay? So then, we go to him speaking, which I'm going to switch to that other. Try to speak to that one. Let's just do it this way. So this was the opening minute of his presentation. And just listen to it.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my ongoing work and specifically how I've developed a model of control of salmonella infection and how the coordination between CD4 T cells and macrophages is really critical for the control of this infection. Now, a little background on CD4 T cells. Many of you are familiar with this slide and the various monopoly of functions that CD4 T cells have. But I want to focus in on the helper functions of CD4 T cells and how that really is their kind of essential function within the context of an immune response. CD4 T cells, once they differentiate and undergo cell division and activation, they can become one of several different flavors. And what's critical here is that this differentiation really imparts a specific.
Okay. So I want to touch on two things. First, since we're focusing on this idea of a baseline, did anyone notice any difference? First of all, was it different?
Yeah.
Raise your hand if you thought it was different. Raise your hand if you thought it was kinda, but not really. A little bit. Okay. Yeah, it wasn't drastically different. Can we agree? Okay. What about it was different for those that heard something? I mean, I agree. It's different. He's presenting. Any specific? Yeah, Brian?
I actually haven't gone through these stats with Chris yet, but vocal range is the first thing that strikes me. Is that it feels a lot flatter.
Yeah, and that's interesting, and we'll return to that. Okay? The vocal range is different, is your first reaction.
And it feels actually like and as an actor, you hear when he's back farther in his voice, as opposed to forward in his resonance.
Okay? Okay, anyone else? Yes.
It wasn't fragmented like when he was trying to.
It wasn't fragmented.
As fragmented.
As fragmented, yes. And there's two aspects to that. One, when we're listening to somebody casually, unstructured, we give them a lot of leeway when it comes to trying to figure out what you're going to say. When you're presenting, we look for more clarity of focus. However, what happens when presenters embrace that, and I think that that's right to do, they tend to go overboard and not package up or what we call phrase the ideas. They don't give us a space to think. They don't package the ideas. And oftentimes what they'll do is, if they're reading or memorize something, they'll go right through to the end of the sentence. Now, sentences have many ideas. And so what ideally you want to do is duplicate when you're thinking, and that is phrase the sentence. Another thing that they'll do is they'll go through as fast as possible to the next slide. In other words, you get artificial disruption of organic thinking. Okay? If you think of unstructured speech as thoughts out loud, when we get up here, it breaks. And sometimes it breaks too far one way, sometimes it breaks too far the other. But that's good.
I feel
Yes?
like it'd be really hard to be perfectly organic when you've probably presented on your research, 50 times at least, or however many times. So you have these key phrases that when you get to this slide,
Right.
I usually say something like this.
Right.
And so then it's not as organic, yes, but
Right.
how do you make it organic? Because
Right.
you've said this a lot. So.
Yeah.
Excellent question.
It's an excellent question, and I hear the question is, how do you make something organic that that you are, that isn't new to you, that isn't right? Well, first of all, let me back up. Your goal in speaking is furthered by making it organic, yes? So there is an interest in doing it, yeah. And then secondly, it can be done. It can be done quite well because if you think about an actor, we perform the same thing hundreds of times. And our job is to make it sound absolutely new every time. It is difficult, but it is not impossible. It is a skill.
What are you trying to, is this what you're trying to say, is that the recipient is going through the same organic process, it needs a little fragments, process?
The recipient reacts to inorganicism differently than organic. If you resemble thoughtful speech, and when I hear Mark present, when I hear great speakers, there's a wonderful quality of presentness. You feel you are hearing ideas, not words. And as a speaker, there's many different ways to approach that. The simplest is to take the idea and try to attack it with different words. Say it a different way. That's a very good shortcut if you're confident enough. It all begins with identifying your goal, which is I want to sound in a way that furthers my connection with the audience. And that is going to be communicating with them, as opposed to a quark is one of the 3 hypothetical subatomic particles of electronic magnitude of 1 to 2/3 more than a proton. I mean, it's dead to me, it's therefore going to be dead to you. So the task becomes clear. We must do what we can to invigorate the speech. So what was that?
Pretend it's organic.
Yeah,
That's what you're doing. Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
You're
yeah.
pretending everything
So
when you
don't
walk
actually,
up.
right, of course.
And
I don't
that's
always
another
think
thing
of that, yeah.
to embrace. I mean, some people say, well, I don't want to fake it. Well, there's a level of artifice in everything that you're doing. I mean, if you were real, I mean, I'd be like, oh man, I don't want to be here. I mean, I love you guys, but come on. Picking my nose. I mean, those are all real things. So what we do is we choose what's most beneficial. We work backwards from what's best. Any other observations? Oh, well, I'll show you some.
I would add to that, Chris, that I remember as a young actor, I thought that acting was about faking most of the time. And as I've grown, I know we've talked about this, as I've grown as an actor, I understand that you actually have to find whatever honesty you can in the moment, because we are very good, humans are very good at perceiving inorganic presentation. And so sometimes it just means you need to reconnect with your original idea in a new way, even though you're using the same words.
Right. It's the metaphor that I've retreated to is sailing, even though I'm not a big sailor. But if I want to get to that point on the shore and there is a crosswind, I need to adjust my course to compensate for that headwind or that crosswind. And so if you're going to stand up and attempt to communicate genuineness and truth, you're going to need to take some efforts in order to preserve that. And there is a paradox. You're doing things to seem truthful, but what it is, it's framing it. So let's take a look at the numbers. So this is what happened when there's something wrong with the bottom, but I'm not going to fix it right now. And what's fast, well, okay, I'll go through it. So he paused less. This is very common. So his speech was more compressed, and that's what I was talking about earlier. He's just going a little faster. Now, is going fast bad? Not necessarily. In fact, speed can give the impression of confidence. If you've ever West Wing and people talking really fast, and even Philadelphia Story. So there is a confidence that comes. If you talk too slow, people get very, very bored. So again, there's no right speed, but phrasing where the pauses are is very helpful, very telling, and very valuable. If I pause between words, I sound like William Shatner. And again, that's inorganic, but the same thing can happen when you listen to someone read something. You can hear them go, they'll take pauses at the period. That's it. But a sentence has more in it than just the period. The speech rate, this is interesting. He slowed down quite a bit. When he talks, there were in little bursts. He was trying to figure things out, and then he had more pauses, and they would come in bursts. And so, and then lastly, and this is interesting for a number of reasons, his pitch range increased dramatically.
I totally agree.
What Brian was saying as far as constrained pitch range is much more common. When someone comes up to speak in front of a group, they tend to be a little bit more conservative with their voice. They don't tend to talk like, oh my God, it was really funny. I went over there and then I came out and oh, this was great. They tend to actually just be in a very narrow range, and I'm going to talk here and that's what I'm going to do. So that's a general trend, but we're dealing with individuals and individual audiences, and what, again, I want to do is present them as individuals. And so we see a challenge to overcome. He had a 24% drop in his pauses. And so what I would want to say is I would want to increase the pauses, because that's who he is, and in general, I think functionally, they could stand to, there could be more of them. He slowed his speech down 16%, and so in general, I thought he could slow, I thought, I didn't hear that, and that's what's interesting about these numbers, and especially when we get to the last one. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess you could pick it up a little bit with pauses. So those are two areas that we could focus on. The last is, I didn't hear that, just like Brian. I didn't hear that his pitch range increased. But after I've gone through it a couple times, he definitely was calmer talking to Brian. And so the exercise is, if you go back and listen to him talking, and then imagine him giving his talk, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to go through a couple things today, and I'm going to start with this, and then I'm going to go to this. I mean, all of a sudden there's like, oh yeah, I kind of like that. At the end of the day, that's what we evaluate all these numbers on, to the degree to which the audience will connect with them. If we decide that how he presented was great, every one of you are like, no, it's fantastic, don't touch a thing, then fine. We don't. But this is a good starting point. Now, kind of fun, I have, this is after Brian had done some exercises with him. So he's going to talk for about a minute. And so let's just listen to it and see if you can hear any difference.
So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus in on Th1 cells, cells that have differentiated after seeing IL-12 in the context of an immune response and have become interferon gamma producing Th1 CD4 T cells. These cells have a particular function where they go out, seek monocytes and macrophages, and engage those cells in expressing their effector functions that result in pathogen control.
I think I cut it off at the laugh. So these are the numbers. So this is his baseline. He didn't make much progress on his pauses. They pretty much stayed about the same, although they did increase, and we'll see that in a little bit. His speech rate, it got bumped up. So it went in the direction that Brian, so this went in the direction, this went in the direction. Look at his pitch range. His pitch range was whacked all the way back down to his baseline. That's what's the most remarkable. And there was something to that. I mean, I don't want to be too reliant on this, but when you listen to it, there was something different. And I ought to have asked you what you thought, but there was a quality to his voice that was different.
What is the range? Normally, the first two are understandable. The scale on the
They're all different.
What is the meaning of the scale? Can you give us an
Semitones.
idea? What is that
These are percentages. These are syllables per second. These are semitones.
So the other thing with pauses, is it silence? Or is it like if he's saying and or something, is that a
Silence.
pause? Okay.
Pause. Not counting disfluence. Yeah. In other words, it's a filled pause. So this is just. It's called. Yeah. That's how they measure it. They set a threshold, and then it's like he's not talking.
So what would be an extreme example of extreme range? What would that such?
Someone who's talking like this and then goes, I mean, it's using your voice, and it's very common. Majority of my clients, I would say 90% of my clients lose range when they speak. So when I'm sitting and talking to them, and they're like, oh, Chris, I can't, you gotta help me out with this presentation. It's just crazy. I get so frustrated. I go up there and I try to present something, and then people think it's not me. And then I hear them present, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to be here today, and I'm really excited to present for you. You know, and so it's not something that you notice in the audience like, he has no range. This man is awful. His range is awful. But you feel it because they're more reserved. They're more conservative. And it's interesting because I had thought when I started measuring, I thought this was going to be the biggest telltale, speech rate. When people get nervous, I thought that they would talk faster because of the adrenaline and the stress. I found that it goes both ways. And actually, 1 in 2 clients will just talk a lot slower when they get in front of a group. That's how they react to stress. So the point is not to say which is better, but rather how is the individual reacting to the stress? And then to compensate for that, to adjust the course if we go back to the sailing.
You also have the amplitude range. You know, how loud and quiet.
The intensity of volume, yes. Yes, there's a tremendous amount of measurements. There are things called glissandos, which I'm actually looking at much more closely. And that's within a syllable if you actually make a pitch change. And that's a huge potential. But these are much more accessible and they're more fundamental. They're not the only ones. So volume intensity is one, but it gets tricky. It's just not as reliable. And then there's behind this. This is not intended to be scientific. This is merely showing you numbers that we use to adjust exercises and interventions and development. So there's a whole extreme where the numbers themselves are treated much more rigorously, and there's tons and tons of studies. It's interesting. For example, there's a study that showed from 1960 to 2000, the presidential candidates that won the popular vote had a consistent tone in their voice that the other one did not. So statistically it was significant, and the study has it, but didn't do a lot of good for me. It'd be great if you could do an intervention and say, hi, you're about to run for president. You should have this tone. So this is the comparison, and this is what's interesting. So this was them speaking the first time, and they had a 2% increase after intervention. This was the rate. Again, it went in the same direction. So we got directions that we wanted. Whether they're significant or consistent, it's an open question, but we were able to move the dial. Does that make sense? So these kinds of measurements are informative, and I think they're informative to describe what we all hear and feel. Make sense? Any questions? Okay, what I'd like to do then is I would like to invite our volunteers today. We're going to do something different. They're going to give their opening minute. If you'd like to set up your slide. They're going to give their opening minute of their talk today. Just their opening minute, or their introduction. And then, so we're going to have one go, and then we're going to have the other go, and then we're going to break up into 2 groups. And we're going to work on the openings. And I will give you something to work on. So for right now, however, just listen to the opening, okay, as if it would be the beginning of the same kind of talks that we've been doing here. And then we'll break into 2 groups that will facilitate a little exercise. Okay? Questions? No? And then I'll have our second speaker go right after.
You just use this mini board,
Yeah.
plug it in, it works. speaker should go first. Oh, there we go. Okay.
You good?
I did. Okay. So.
You can. Just. Whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. My name is Katie Block. I am a postdoc in the Center for Immunology. And today I'm going to talk to you about a project studying the effect of normal microbial exposure on immune responses to airway allergens. And this talk, I decided to focus specifically on CD4 positive T cells. And I want to start this presentation with a simplified graph that I think really can get to the point quickly of why I'm doing this project. So I think that this demonstrates something that we're all familiar with, which is that the incidence of allergic diseases is much higher than it was maybe decades ago in westernized countries. So things like seasonal allergies or hay fever, allergic asthma, and food allergies are all have really increased recently, and this correlates with a lot of changes in the way that we live our lives. If you think about industrialization and moving away from agriculture, as well as changes to diet and hygiene, such as the use of antibiotics. And so this idea that these changes in our environment affecting our susceptibility to allergic diseases is something called the hygiene hypothesis. And some other people have coined similar phrases that get at a similar point, such as the old friends hypothesis and the biodiversity hypothesis. And I think that these names might better capture what we think is happening in terms of our exposure to microbes, for example, and our development of asthma. Okay, I'll stop there.
That's great. Excellent. A round of applause, please. So we'll invite our second speaker up. And again, this is just the introduction. We're going to be working on this and then revisiting it later today, and I'll explain a little bit more after the second speaker goes, okay? And, oh, well. Perfect day to do it.
Oh, it's doing something highly bizarre on my computer.
You will not be judged on your slides at all today, so.
Well, I don't know.
Right, explicitly. Whatever.
I'm Laura, and I work in Sylvia Bowles' lab here in the Cancer Center. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about a pilot study that we conducted. We were trying to look at the effects of hangover, and we want to better characterize how we can characterize hangover. Can I start over?
You may.
Thank you. Okay, I'm Laura Martins. I'm a PhD. No, I gotta start again.
That's fine,
That's
that's fine.
All right, I'm
Ready?
Laura Martins, and I'm a postdoc in Sylvia Bowles' lab here in CCRB. And today I'm going to be talking about a pilot study that we conducted about hangover. We're trying to better characterize or find a way to assess hangover symptoms and severity in individuals. So most people are familiar with hangover. So after intoxication, there's a combination of cognitive and physical effects that people typically will experience. And this can be in the form of fatigue, nausea, stomach pains, and inability to concentrate.
Okay, that's good. And applause, please. No, you did great. So, here's what I would like to do. I would like to talk a little bit about the general function of an opening, and I'd like to break into two small groups, and I would like you to talk as a small group with the volunteers today. And I'm offering up a structure that I believe accomplishes the function of a good opening. And I believe, so if we go to the overall goal, which is to impart information, to establish a relationship with the audience in a way that significantly induces some kind of change in the audience, whether it's behavior usually, but it could be as little as thinking, I suppose. So the first thing that I believe needs to be done is there needs to be some type of point of agreement. In other words, the speaker needs to connect with the audience so that the audience knows that they are on the same team, that they are together, that there is a common departure point. If there isn't an explicit agreement, and this can be very, very simple, like, good morning, cold weather we're having here today. That's very fundamental, but at least the audience on a relationship level is like, oh, okay, seems like a nice guy. In other words, you're making these evaluations. And it can be more explicit when it comes to the information. I think we can all agree that hangovers are bad. Like, yeah, and the point is to get either explicitly or metaphorically heads nodding, people buying in. It's a very important function in getting the audience to go with you on that journey. If you've ever heard a speaker who's off and running and you're having difficulty catching up or quite frankly caring, why do I care? That doesn't further our three goals. So we want to give the audience a chance to see you as a person and to hear your idea in their context. So that's how agreement plays a role, is to say, oh, I know what this guy's talking about. I know what you're talking about. Okay, great, here we go. And in your peer group, it's going to be fairly easy. But I think it's more important than ever to not skip this step, which is to get some sort of common agreement or to forge that. Does that make sense? Second, you relate it in a larger context. This is where you begin to introduce. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just have a question on the agreement statement or the
Sure.
first step.
Yeah.
Should it be more like, okay, comment on the weather, or should it be more, I'll bring you into my topic and I'll make a comment on hangover? And the reason why I'm asking this is that I've seen a lot of people using this
Yep.
first, and sometimes it's really just doesn't work. It's like they make a little joke and
Yep.
you're like, instead of buying it in, you're just like, okay.
Yep. Yep, so the answer is those are two tools, those are two approaches to their extremes. Neither is inherently bad. There are a number of considerations. The overall consideration is to connect with the audience about an idea through your expression of it. And so if you don't get to the idea, it's going to frustrate the audience. And I'm a huge proponent of being as efficient as possible. So if you can forge agreement personally and on your idea at the same time, great. For somebody who has a hard time imbuing their ideas agreement personally, then that's where you get something very simple, like, hello, thank you for coming. I mean, these are all the things you hear, and this is why people are doing them. Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. Is it really necessary to do that? No. I'm so happy to be here. Are you really? Nice day, is it? I mean, but at the same time, it does fulfill the purpose. We're getting a sense. In law, when you examine a witness, you ask a bunch of questions that nobody really needs the answer to. So what they're doing is they're giving everyone a chance to get to know the person. So if you are playing it would be problematic if you were to walk up and say, I think we can all agree that T cells are da-da-da-da-da. There's a little abruptness to it where I'm getting used to you as a person. So there's usually a little bit, and both speakers did this today. Hello everyone, my name is. That's a great agreement, which is, okay, great. I see your name, yep, you seem like a nice person, go ahead. And then the next one is, I think we can all agree that 1 equals 2. Whoa, 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 what? I mean, immediately I'm out. So, if you can do it with your idea, great, which is hello. Usually it's hello. I think we can all agree that T cells are something that are really important and more people should study them. Well, I want to tell you why more people should study them, because they are the, so all of a sudden they introduce this context where you're like, this is where I'm going to expand my understanding. So you've given me an agreement, we share that assumption, now we're going to go somewhere. Great. And then the last is your main point. Your thesis. And I think it should be said as early as possible. So in theory, these could be 3 sentences, they could be 2, it'd be tough if they're 1. But these functions need to happen in the first 60 seconds because you have as close to 90% attention at no other point in the speech than the opening. I don't care how good a speech it is, it's not going to happen. So when you walk up there, I mean, just because you're moving, we're watching you, and you're new, you're different, I'm going to listen to you a little bit, and now I'm going to stop paying attention. So make use of that time when people are giving it to you. And so if you can do this, now it doesn't have to necessarily be this explicit, but I want to hold this out because I think it is helpful. Many different ways to do it, but this is something I've run into and I've been using more and more because I think it's a good way to start. Now to go back to the delivery question, practicing your opening and knowing exactly what you're going to do allows a comfort that will carry over if you're able to nail that beginning part. There's so much that you don't have control of. What you do have control of is your material as far as how you prepare it. And that's something that I want to, that's the intent of this, is to really get you to direct that energy. Okay? So, here's what I would like to do in these small groups. So if one of the speakers can circle over there and one here, what I would like you to do is give your opening again. And I want the group to ask questions about what it is that you're going to present. And you can explain as much as you want. It's very casual. But I want the opening to be indicative of the rest of the talk. This was something that, Mark, you commented on last presenter. You felt that it would have been nicer to hear the lead was buried. You thought that was interesting. You really want to make sure that you indicate what it is that you're going to be talking about as early as possible. So in small groups, I want you to understand what the talk is going to offer up. What is the big point? What's the main idea? And there can only be one. There can only be one idea. If it's a collection of ideas, I mean, if it's 3 ideas, then you have to bundle them together, fundamentally, okay? Because you walk out of a talk and someone says, what was the talk about? Well, it's about 5 things. This, and this. And that never happens. I mean, you say it was about this, or it was about these 2 things, maybe. Okay? And this will help. If you go from this, it will inform this and this. Okay? Does that make sense? And so, very casual, I want to spend about 15 minutes just talking through. So, I believe Brian and I will each go in the group and facilitate the small group session. But we want to get a sense of how we can accomplish this with the small group, with the speakers. Sound good? Okay, so it doesn't matter how we do this. In fact, since we're all clumped over here, why don't we just go like this row up here, and then this row back, and then we have one of you be with this group, and then you be with that. Okay? So you're the dividing line up, if you would like. Okay? Let's try this for explicitly invite the audience into making sure you're being as efficient as possible with that opening minute. And so we're gathering together to hear the content again. So there's an effort to connect it more with the speaker, but more importantly, what we're hopefully going to hear is a more effective touching on these elements of what I believe go to make up a good opening. Okay? So let's take a listen and see what we think.
All right, thanks. So I'm going to talk to you today about a mouse model we have in the lab that we call normal microbial exposure, or you might have also heard the term dirty mouse. And we think that these dirty mice can serve as a great model to test the hygiene hypothesis. So this is just a simplified graph showing that in recent decades, the incidence of allergic diseases, such as asthma, which I'll be focusing on, have increased relative to a few decades ago. And this seems to be correlated with changes in our lifestyle and our environment, such as vaccination strategies, improved sanitation, and use of antibiotics. So we can think of this like Pigpen, who rolls around in the dirt and probably gets lots of colds and things, is protected from asthma, while Charlie Brown has gotten all of his vaccinations and doesn't get sick, but now he's developed asthma. And so we are using a mouse model to model these two conditions. We have the laboratory-specific pathogen-free mice that I think most of us who do animal research use to model Charlie Brown, who has limited infections, while we can use mice that naturally acquire mouse pathogens, like wild mice or pet store mice, to model Pigpen, who's had a lot of these infections and is protected from disease. I can keep going, or I can stop there.
That's great.
Yeah.
I think it's good.
So,
Thank you.
As I was starting, I remember we kind of gotten some feedback, and I think we landed on not introducing the dirty mice right away and just going to the graph, but I did it kind of opposite way. So
That's good. I mean, what yeah, let's talk more about it
Okay,
after
yeah.
the second. You don't want to do it at all?
Come on, Laura, you got it.
Come on.
It's a safe place.
Just do a little bit. Just do a little bit.
It doesn't matter, I'm not bringing a computer.
Whenever you're ready.
Whenever I'm ready. Okay, today I'm going to talk to you about hangover, and most of you are going to be familiar with the symptoms of hangover. But what we're looking at it is from a public health issue standpoint. So if you are experiencing cognitive impairment because you are hungover, chances are you're going to be at a greater risk for having a work-related or a driving accident. And unlike intoxication, or if you are on drugs where they can measure it or test it, with hangover, there really is no way to measure if somebody's experiencing a hangover or the severity of their hangover. So what we want to do is develop or find a biomarker so that we can use this to assess if somebody's experiencing hangover symptoms and the severity of those symptoms. So what we're proposing to do, or what we've done, is we've done a pilot study where we bring people into the clinic and we give them a dose of alcohol to induce hangover. And then we have them do a cognitive test before and after, and we have them assess their typical hangover symptoms and what they're experiencing at the end of the study, so that we can try to better understand how their cognitive impairment could relate to these biomarkers that we're trying to identify.
Wonderful! So, I thought that was really good. I'd like to hear from you. What did you think?
Both were much better. You really got pulled in.
I agree. I agree. A lot of the work was intended to touch on these elements, and the effect was we got to the meat of what you were trying to present to us quicker, and that makes the audience happier. I'm happy. What a lot of we're fighting against as presenters is you've worked on this topic so much, there's a real inductive trajectory to your point. Oh, I've got to say this, and this. But for an audience, it's much better if you tell them the conclusion in many ways and then unpack it. And that's what I felt we got much more of. Now, there are other aspects to clarity in addition to substance, and I'm going to take a look at them between now and next session and share with you some of the delivery aspects. Now, we took a hit on some of them. There were a couple disfluencies, but that was trading for much more thoughtful engagement with ideas. And in fact, the level of ums doesn't rise to a point where it was distracting. It wasn't to me. They were there, but I noticed them mostly because they weren't there as much before. But that kind of dirty communication is actually interesting. So I'm not advocating for ums, but at a low level, it's okay, especially when we hear engagement with ideas. And that's usually where if you get down to disfluencies, a good disfluency is right before someone is going to say something meaningful that actually heightens listener attention. If I were to say that your presentation was interesting, I mean, you're like, oh my God, what is it going to be? What is it going to be? And then that was sarcasm. Like, no, it wasn't. It's good. It's good. As opposed to someone who says in between every like, what's going on? So they have two different meanings. Phrasing is another indicator of clarity that helps us understand the ideas, and we got a lot of really good phrasing because it was completely organic. And that's one way, is to completely shake it up and to work off of just the ideas. But I thought it was really good. Any other reactions or things you noticed? Anyone?
You know, I don't know your name. What's your name?
Rashi.
What's that?
Rashi.
Rashi asked an interesting question about how do you know when you've gone too long or you haven't gone long enough in the introduction? And as I said to you in the group, and I thought it's of an analogy that may be apropos, and that is that the introduction is not like baking, where there's definite ingredients at a definite amount of time. It's more like making soup, and you kind of have to see what works when the flavors start to come out. And as frustrating as that may be, you see that what Laura did, just after a couple of iterations, the soup started to take some good flavor, right? And now we want to have more. Yeah, you can't come into it with the false impression that you can lay everything out perfectly and it will work.
I like that a lot. That analogy is very strong. The components are critical. The proportion is very open. In other words, if you don't touch on these, I think it's going to be difficult to make the kind of connections we're talking about. You could do it. You need to have it done. So I think the minimum would be a couple sentences. But you could, depending on your material and your personality, have an introduction that's very long if it's accomplishing its purpose. Some excellent deliverers can hold our attention without saying anything for quite a while. But I would encourage you to be simpler than more complicated or challenging, and to just get it out of the way and touch the points that we had discussed today, because I don't think that they would serve you wrong. If you search for audience agreement, that's great. I think that depending on the audience, you're not going to go wrong with that unless you have a level of agreement where people don't agree, which then it's not an agreement, or if it's too low level that it doesn't connect with the context, then it's boring. Does that make sense? So, again, with all of this, there are very few aspects of it, except at its extremes, where there are hard limits. The human ear can only hear, I think, 350 words a minute. It gets difficult to understand. Or there's an articulation level where we can't hear. But that isn't something that we've dealt with in this arena. It's more of the ingredients, and they need to be there. And introductions are something that I think lack in rigor and can benefit from a little bit more. All right, I'm going to tell you what my main point is right away. You can't really go wrong. I just don't see how including these components, telling people what you're going to say, is going to ruin the talk or have a detrimental impact. I just can't imagine it. Not to say it can't happen, someone might show that to me, but I think it's improbable. And that's what we're dealing with, probabilities. Now, for next week, is there anything that you would like to see? I'm sorry? Next month.
Okay.
Next month. I don't have I don't have the particular theme that we're going to be working on, and I might be working from a different theme list, but it will be something different.
You got a whole list.
I do. Engagement was last week, clarity's this week, you've got a different, anyways. We'll be focusing on different, very important and beneficial aspects to focus on. Is there anything about what you've heard today that you would be interested in seeing measured next week? I want to invite you. So I showed you a little of what I measured last week. Is there anything as audience members that I'm trying to explain this to you about, or as scientists that you would be interested in seeing? And you don't have, if something occurs to you, you can let me know, but I'm going to continue to explore those and share them with you.
Chris, have you, in any of the sessions, this one or before that, done anything related to slide design? I know that in some of the past years, iterations of this, you did that, and I felt like there was
Sure.
some really important nuggets there, and you actually were then
Yep.
talking about some of the research that goes into how you design a good slide.
We,
I don't know if that's worth
absolutely,
going
absolutely.
over, because some people are new.
That's good. So let's tag that. So we will focus, whatever our focus is next week, I believe we can.
I think it's focus.
Engagement, clarity, focus, and relevance.
Yeah, well,
were the
you
four.
could
Well, you can
argue
see
that.
a slide focusing, right?
It's great. So we're going to usurp our focus and look at it graphically. And we're going to see how the delivery supports it. And let me, do we have volunteers ahead of time? Whoever's volunteering, you guys have been fantastic. And what's so great is the effort that you've brought and the willingness to take feedback. It's critical to development. So thank you very much. And next week, with an eye towards focus, one of the reasons I haven't been so adamant about it is there's been such huge progress,
No,
light years.
That's why I want you to keep at it. 'Cause
Okay.
Sitting here watching millions of CFI talks, I've
It's,
learned to appreciate
okay.
incredible progress there. But I think maybe what's been lost a little bit though is the why. You know, what people have simpler slides now, but I think that's
Sure.
just one element. What is
Yeah.
the research that connects the simplicity with getting your message across?
Wonderful. I'll be happy to address that. That's great. And that is helpful to hear.
This slide is good because
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there's, great. That'll be really good.
I think it actually is a great segue from what we did today, because for instance, when Laura got up without any slides at all,
Right.
our focus and her focus was
Yeah.
much clearer,
Yeah.
and the message was more effectively delivered. And you know, slides, of course, ideally, speaker support only furthers that clarity, as opposed to detracts from it.
Great. Yeah, and there are some very non-controversial fundamentals of the interaction we've lost because we have the technology. People want to put in this transition or put in this graph because you can. And taking a step back and saying, okay, when someone is talking and there's writing on the screen, what is the audience going to do from a cognitive standpoint? It's almost like a magic trick that you're trying to pull off, which is focus on me, and that needs to be supportive, and so we'll address how best to support you, and that's what we want to do. And that's very different from delivering a deck, because that also can be done, and we'll talk about that. If you send it to somebody and it lives written without you, that's very, very different. Good? Anyone else? Thank you. This is great. I enjoyed it. We'll try to keep that level of audience, small group participation. Thank you very much.